The Azure Feather by Peter E. Homan. Chapter 1. A New Setting. "They're here!" shouted Annie, with her nose pressed against the dining room window. It had been 3 months since the children had their last adventure, and having the Darvilles come to visit them in the city was a treat Annie had been looking forward to for quite some time. She dashed across the freshly polished hardwood floor, deaf to Mother's pleas of not running in the house, and skidded towards the front door. After all, it was not every day that they had the opportunity to entertain their beloved friends. "Hello, darling," said Mrs. Darville as the front door flew open. The Darvilles were lined up behind each other, their familiar faces happily smiling away at the girls' antics. "Welcome," said Annie, performing her best curtsy and holding out her hand to extend an invitation for them to enter. "Oh, how lovely," remarked Mrs. Darville, who wandered down the corridor, admiring the collection of family photographs adorning the wall, with a few familiar ones from their adventures on the farm. Father appeared from his office, smiling broadly. He had been doing so more often as of late. Ever since the children busted the diamond smugglers during their last visit to Devil's Leap, he had received nothing but praise for his hard work in seeing that justice was served. He was even promoted at work, and had been quite content with his new lease on life. He had also been spending more time with his children, and he and Robert built a marvellous treehouse in the backyard. Mr. Darville, on the other hand, looked a bit grumpy as he stumbled into the house and extended the customary steely-handed greeting towards Father. "I'll never get used to the traffic you city folk have to contend with," he snorted. Annie smiled. It was the holidays after all, and the traffic was much lighter than usual, even with it being the winter months, which usually saw more people stay home rather than go on vacation. "Well," said Father quite amusedly, "you're here now. Let me give you a hand with your luggage." "No need," said Anton, who came strolling into the house carrying the Darville's belongings. He had grown since they last saw him, thought Annie. Come to think of it, she had too. She made light work of clambering up the tree to help in the treehouse construction, and was finding it much easier to reach the top shelf in the pantry, where Father hid his secret sweet stash, in a dingy old flour tin. "We brought gifts," exclaimed Ellie, holding out a large satchel filled with boxes and wrapped presents. She too had grown during their time apart, not so much in height, but in stature. It would not be long before she was too old to adventure with them, thought Annie, who swiftly let that thought drift from her mind. After all, they should enjoy every moment together, regardless of what the future might hold. "Oh, goody!" cried Annie, as she rushed forward, grabbing the bag and flinging her arms around Ellie, her previous thought now a long-lost memory. "We got you something special," laughed Anton. Annie's eyes grew as she stared at the large satchel in front of her. "Why didn't you put that away, and you can open them a little later," said Mother, who appeared from the kitchen. "Welcome to our humble home," she added, before greeting each of the Darvilles in a typically extroverted fashion. "Where's Robert?" said Ellie finally, after pleasantries had been exchanged. "He's been up in that treehouse for the past 3 days," said Annie. "He even missed dinner the other night." Her face turned grim at the thought of skipping a meal, especially since it was Mother's lamb stew with mashed potatoes, which was by far the best thing she made. "Will you go and fetch him?" said Mother, slightly displeased at the boy's absence. "We'll go with you," replied Ellie, happy to surprise him. Robert was glued to his telescope when Annie came clambering up the rope ladder. He swiftly closed the small notepad he was doodling in and swung around to see his little sister's blonde locks shooting up through the trapdoor, followed swiftly by her inquisitive blue eyes. "What are you doing?" she inquired as she heaved herself into the treehouse. "Don't you know that our guests have arrived?" "I know," Robert mumbled before neatening his collar. After all, he had seen them coming up the street leading to the cul-de-sac, but there were more pressing matters at hand. "I'm coming." "There's no need to rush," said Ellie, who appeared through the trapdoor as well, followed by Anton. They were all together again, and even though it had been quite some time since they last saw each other, it was as if it had been yesterday that they were scurrying about Devil's Leap in Anton's trusty old truck. Anton let out a whistle and stomped his feet on the wooden floor to test its sturdiness. "This is a nice treehouse," he added, before shoving an outstretched arm in Robert's direction. "Thanks," said Robert proudly. "My dad and I built it ourselves." He met the boy's grip, and they shared a smile before he noticed Annie's steely stare. "Annie helped as well," he added, to his sister's approval. "It's so nice to see you again," said Ellie, as she gave the boy a hug. "So, this is where the smartest boy I know spends his time?" she added, admiring the room. Robert smiled and hastily packed away the pile of books standing next to the telescope before anybody saw his cheeks turning a bright red. "Pish posh!" Annie said grumpily, showing a disagreement with Ellie's statement. She stared Robert dead in the eye and firmly placed her hands on her hips. The others looked at her in bemused silence. "What's wrong?" she moaned, as she felt their collective gaze analysing her. "Since when do you use such language?" laughed Ellie. "She's been saying all sorts of strange things recently," said Robert, meeting his sister's steely stare. "Ever since our new neighbour, Mrs. Price, moved into the neighbourhood last month." "She sounds like a sophisticated lady," laughed Anton. "Quite the contrary," Robert replied. "She's a bit of a weird one." "No, she isn't," said Annie angrily. "Robert just doesn't like her because he fell off his bicycle in front of their driveway and his sons made fun of him." Robert gave her another look, arching his brow as if to challenge her to repeat her previous statement. "In any case," said Ellie, sensing that the siblings might have at each other if she didn't intervene, "what are you looking at through your telescope?" "Oh, I'm just bird watching," replied Robert. He moved closer towards the desk, where his notepads were stacked, trying to distract from his records. "Bird watching?" exclaimed Annie. "We have like 6 different types of birds here, each of them more boring than the other." "What do you know about birds?" said Robert derisively. "I'll have you know there are more than 300 different species of birds living in and around this city." "Never mind the birds," said Anton, who had perched himself firmly behind the telescope. "You have quite the view over the neighbourhood from here." He did indeed. Father was quite meticulous in choosing the most aesthetic spot when they began planning the treehouse. On a clear evening, one could even see the lights of the central business district dazzling away brightly. "Are you spying on the neighbours, Robbie?" said Annie teasingly. "No, I'm not," Robert replied sternly, before changing the subject. "Now, I'm sure our parents are wondering where we are. Let's not let them wait any longer, shall we?" Annie shot her brother a skeptical look, but decided to rather keep the questions to a minimum, at least for the time being, that is. Moreover, she had a cunning little plan, which would require as little suspicion as possible from her older brother. She waited for the boys to help Ellie down the rope ladder, and just when Robert finally disappeared down the trapdoor, she lunged at the stack of notebooks and grabbed the first one that would stick. She stuck it under her shirt and touched it tightly beneath her arms. She listened intently to ensure that the others had already left for the house and snuck down the ladder. Clutching the book under one arm and struggling to support herself with the other, her foot slipped, skipped a step, and with a shriek she came to a halt, 2 steps lower. "Are you okay?" said Anton from below. Annie's heart sank as she tried to hide the notebook while turning around. "Oh, I'm all right," she replied. "Spick and span." "I see you nabbed a little something there," Anton said, pointing to the obvious outline of the notebook protruding from under Annie's sleeve. "Don't tell him," Annie whispered, holding her finger up against her lip. Anton gave her a wry smile and went on his way. "That was lovely," exclaimed Mrs. Darwell as she placed her cutlery down on the clean plate in front of her. It was Mother's lamb stew, and everybody else agreed that it was delicious. Annie patted her belly and sighed as she realized that there was still an entire malva pudding that needed to be devoured. "How are the Bellows?" asked Father, himself struggling a little after the heavy meal. "They are well," said Mr. Darwell. "Temba's looking after the dogs while we're in the city." "Oh, I would so love to see them again," said Mother, who indicated to Robert and Annie to collect the dishes. "They did mention that they would be coming to the city quite soon," Mrs. Darwell replied. "Why don't you give them a call and see whether you can arrange something?" "That sounds like a splendid idea," said Father. "Now," he continued, looking towards the children, "have you kids got anything planned for the holidays?" "I'm sure they'll find something with which to keep themselves busy," said Mr. Darwell. "As long as there are no haunted houses and missing diamonds, I'm sure they won't get up to too much trouble." He gave them a playful yet intimidating smile, as if to tell them that any clandestine adventures were strictly off limits during their visit. Indeed, it would be a wholly different adventure this time around. They were without Anton's trusty truck, and the city certainly limited the range of their travels. They did have their bicycles in the garage, and Anton and Ellie could make use of Mother and Father's, which the latter had bought a few years ago in hopes of keeping his family fit. Father took a ride around the block once, before pulling a hamstring and being confined to bed rest for a week. "At least we have that awesome treehouse," said Anton. "I'm sure we can figure out something to do." "Well, you children better not stay up too late," said Mrs. Darwell, as she dished them each a bowl of dessert. "We're going to the mall tomorrow." This statement brought on a collective sigh, save for Mother and Ellie, who were quite excited about the prospect of spending the better half of the next day scurrying around the shops and trying on clothes. "Do we really have to go?" Annie whispered, leaning towards her brother. She despised the shops. Walking endlessly, trying on clothes, less than half of which would be bought at the end of the day. It was maddeningly boring. I don't think we can get out of it, Robert replied, looking at the rather despondent-looking Anton, who spooned at his dessert in quiet contemplation. At the very least, you'll be able to visit the toy store. He knew just what to say to cheer up his little sister. Annie's eyes sparkled. This was not for the idea of the toy store, but rather the outdoor equipment dealer next to said store. She had been eyeing a set of climbing hooks for a while, which would certainly come in handy should she encounter a more challenging object to conquer than the large syringa tree in the backyard. And you two are coming along, said Mrs. Darvell, pointing towards Father and Mr. Darvell, who had tried their utmost to remain invisible during the planning of this trip. Oh, I'm sure we don't want to be in the way, now do we? Said Father, seeking confirmation from Mr. Darvell, who was eager to concur. Oh no, of course not, replied the latter. And what about the environment? He stuttered. If one were to look closely enough, one would see a droplet of sweat rolling down his temple. The environment, said Mrs. Darvell skeptically, looking towards Mother in anticipation of some half-hearted excuse. Yes, the environment, Father interjected. We would surely have to take 2 cars to the mall, and that would just be wasteful. Greenhouse gases and all that jazz. Mother and Mrs. Darvell showed a look of amusement and smiled. Robert, Anton, and Annie stared at their fathers in disbelief. The men winked at each other and smiled mockingly, yet playfully, at their kin. Very well, said Mother. Then you two can prepare dinner. We're having slow-braised oxtail with vichyssoise to start, and a lovely black cherry clafouti for dessert. The men shared a befuddled look, partly because they did not understand a single word of what Mother had just said, but also because they had planned to play a round of golf while the wives and children were out and about. Father turned to face Robert, who was grinning widely and justly back at his father. Looks like we got the long end of the stick, said Annie, chuffed with her having escaped poultry duty. I don't think that saying works both ways, whispered Robert. Sure it does, Annie replied stubbornly. They have the short end, she added, pointing to Father and Mr. Darvell. That must mean that we have the long end. I'd be careful not to get a hiding from that stick, whatever the length, laughed Anton. Annie merely smiled and tucked her arms under the table. She dreaded going to the mall, but with their great friends there alongside them, it might not be as bad as all that.